Last week, I posted on Facebook sharing my thoughts about Amy Coney Barrett's opening statement during her Supreme Court nomination hearing. Specifically, I posted the transcript where she briefly describes her 7 children. My Facebook post said, "Anyone notice how Amy Coney Barrett spoke of her biological kids in terms of their intellectual prowess and spoke of her adopted kids about their trauma history?" I'm Angela Tucker, and welcome to The Adoptee Next Door, where I interview adoptees about living the adopted life.
I don't dislike Amy Coney Barrett. I don't want to attack her motherhood. I don't even know her. That's not the point. You can love your children and still participate in their oppression through the language you use.
That was Torie DiMartile, a fellow transracial adoptee who is currently studying domestic transracial adoption at Indiana University. I was already scheduled to talk with Torie about DNA testing and her experience as a biracial adoptee, but I knew she'd have lots of thoughts on the recent events too. The first part of our conversation is about Torie's racial identity, and then Torie and I discuss Amy Coney Barrett, and specifically we were wondering whether adoption can ever be discussed on a large scale with the nuance, humility, and open mind that is required.
So I'm studying transracial adoption within the context of the US. So my specificity is on Black and brown individuals that have been placed into white homes, but especially looking at the legacy of child removal within communities of color, which has largely been for political and cultural gains of various sorts. And transracial adoption is one of those processes that fascinates me as an anthropologist. It's very charged with lots of different social and economic impacts, but it's also something very intimate and something very visceral. So how is something that is part of this huge complex network something that individuals actually experience? That's what's of interest to me.
It makes me just think anytime I find myself being frustrated with a system or the system, I always come back to the fact that systems are comprised of individuals.
Of people, yeah.
They're people, you know? It's easy to forget that and to just think of systems as this otherworldly entity that you can bash on, but... And so you identify as a transracial adoptee. Your race is kind of ambiguous. How do you identify?
Yeah, so that's been a process, to be honest. When I was brought home into my family, my parents are from Northern Kentucky, and they adopted me from Ohio. My parents were unsure of what my racial identity was. My birth mother's white, and she knew my birth father, but wasn't aware of how he identified racially. So my parents kind of just went with the flow, and we had a small Dunkin' Donuts that we frequented every Saturday, and it was owned by an Indian family. And they thought I looked just like their daughters when they were young, so they would always give me free donuts. And my parents were like, "We've adopted her. We're really not sure if she's Indian or not." And they would say, "Oh, she's Indian. Believe us. She's totally Indian. We would know." So for a while, that's how I identified. That's what my parents told me.
When you were a kid through elementary school?
Probably, toddlerhood to, early elementary school.
Wow.
And then, I always really longed to know more. My parents read me such gorgeous, colorful, diverse picture books. And I was a storyteller from the get-go. So I always wanted to know more about my story. And as I started asking more questions, my parents decided, let's reach out to the agency and to her birth mother to see if we can contact and meet her birth father, so that we can answer these questions that just are gnawing inside of her. You know, who am I? What is my heritage? If I am Indian, is there a language that my first family spoke? Are there customs? Are there recipes? Like, this is a huge gap. And in order to fill that, we searched for my birth father, found him when I was 11 and met him. And he was like, nope, you're not from India. You're African-American and Seminole Native American Indian.
Wow.
And he is very dark, very just rich, beautiful, ebony skin. And that's what I was told. And that was kind of a revelation. And so I started learning more about Native American and African-American history. And slowly but surely that just kind of became the identity that I donned. Was, okay, I'm a biracial individual. I'm part white, I'm part Black, and I'm part Seminole Native American Indian. And so I've called myself multiracial, but I don't know much about my Indian ancestry, my Native American Indian ancestry. So I can't, that doesn't feel as salient as an identity for me. And I don't know if you have experienced this, but especially with an adoption, the information is so vague. So while he told me that was my history, my heritage, when I finally got my agency documents just maybe 6 months ago, they did not have Native American as part of my racial background. So
yeah. But it may make sense. I don't know how involved your birth dad was when you were born, and if he had a relationship with your birth mother, which would then transfer into your files. So meeting him when you were 11, maybe he had more information or more agency to tell you what he knew, or so
that's always, but I think that's honestly a trademark of adoption, right? You have these like traces and these residues of truth that are hidden, and you kind of have to peel them apart in these layers. And there's the oral history that your first family may be telling you, but then there's also the transcript and document official history, which may not always be congruent.
Right. We know so many adoptees who had different birth dates marked in their file than their birth parents say that's not their birth date. And so that makes me wonder about DNA testing. Was that something you decided to do given all the complexity and confusion around this?
Yeah. So, and it was actually less around the confusion of, am I Native or am I not Native? And it was more around the lived experiences of feeling like bifurcated, of like, okay, I am identified by much of the world as Black. A lot of the rest of the world just sees me as ambiguous.
Yeah.
And then there's people who just would like me to be white, would like me to act white and say, oh, you're just white with a tan, like just be white.
White with a tan.
I know. I'm like,
who are
all
those
year
people?
Round? White people would say that. And these were classmates, right? Who I think felt uncomfortable with me identifying as Black and biracial because they couldn't digest that. They didn't know other Black people. And I think that was maybe like a self-protective mechanism for them of, we want to be able to discern what you are definitively. So we're just going to call you what we believe you should be socially and culturally based off of the family you were put into. So I just had tons of experiences where I felt like everyone was trying to tell me who I was.
Yes.
White people were like, you need to act more white. You're too Black. You act like you, the criticisms or the experiences you have of the white world makes us feel like you don't like us. And then with Black people, it was often, you're not Black enough. Your parents probably taught you to hate Black people.
Wow.
You're not a real Black person.
Oof. I've heard
So,
that
and I
one.
know you've heard that
Oh,
from someone in the adoption world.
yep.
So it was those comments which just like cut me to my core, that I was like, I don't want to be straddling anymore. I don't want to feel like I'm just a leaf in the wind being blown back and forth to all these different identities. I want to know exactly what I am.
Was that
For
pretty steadfast, or were there times that you can remember in your life where you tried to just accommodate what other people were saying that you were? Were there times when you're like, all right, if you guys are going to call me white with a tan, or that I'm not acting black enough, did you kind of code switch to the extremes in that way ever?
You know, not really, because I was so saturated in whiteness. I mean, my biracial sister is the only other individual that I had consistent contact with that was not white, and she's lighter than I am. And I didn't have any black teachers. There was no black people at our church. My first black friend was when I was 16, and I went to like a camp. And because of that, I knew internally I was not white. I was like, what? There's no way I'm not white. Like, there's all these experiences I've had in the world that have told me that I'm not white.
Right.
So I knew that. And internally, I identified as a person of color. But I didn't make waves for the first probably 20 years of my life.
What do you mean by that? Didn't make waves? Like you just kind of let it be, even though internally you knew it wasn't right.
So, like, for instance, I would go in. So I wrote voraciously about what it felt like to be a person of color, to be this black biracial individual in this completely white world. But I never corrected anybody. I never, put those kinds of statements out publicly like I do now, right? I have that Instagram account. I speak very vocally on Facebook. When a classmate said, oh, I would never marry a black girl, I just didn't say anything, right? Or when I went to Cincinnati with my classmates and I was the only person of color, a couple black students that were also doing this big field trip said that I was a white N-word because I was with all these white people and I didn't dress as a black person would dress. I didn't speak as what they anticipated a black person would speak like. Wow. So I had these experiences, but I never brought them to the forefront. Yeah. I never, tried to engage with people and say, wait a second, that's not right.
So you went inward with it. You wrote, you expressed the incongruence. The dissonance. You expressed that inwardly. At what point did you decide to start speaking out publicly about this?
I mean, I wouldn't say it was like a night and day switch. Like I've always been a passionate person, but it was kind of like I was leaving little crumbs on the way, right? I would practice dipping my toe out. And for instance, a couple years ago, before I decided to, fully jump in to making this a story I wanted to share publicly, I wrote a blog post about the church and how it needed to take racial justice more seriously. And someone in my church community commented to a family member and said, so do you hate white people like she hates white people? And it was stuff like that started to really move me in the direction of saying, I don't know if the life I've been living is actually what I thought it was. Like, there's all these people who, they love Torie. They love how Torie laughs and Torie's fun to be around. And they say that they care deeply for me. And they're all white individuals. But what happens when I start to have something critical to say about my experience in the world and about what whiteness has done to me? Then so, they're not so nice anymore.
Kind of a token. You were a token for many folks.
Yes.
When people would see you conforming to what they desired you were. But
right.
anytime you started to have thoughts that might shine some light on a little bit more of a complex understanding
yes.
of it all, then people would be like, I'm not so sure about you. I mean, that sounds like forced assimilation to me.
Yes. It's, you are not staying in the predetermined box that you've been given. You are breaking the boundary. And truly, you're destabilizing whiteness. That's what I was doing, right? You are making whiteness, you're giving whiteness a mirror to see itself, and we don't want to see whiteness, right? Because that's not something whiteness wants. Whiteness wants and functions when it is the default, when it's invisible, right? When it's the standard. And if you give it a mirror, it can no longer be the standard. So what I was doing was, when I say rocking the boat, I say I was destabilizing a notion of what whiteness is. Okay, here's this girl who has the accoutrements of whiteness, right? The upper middle class house, the right zip code, the right clothes, the standard English, and the Midwestern Ohio accent. But she is not falling in line. She's problematizing whiteness rather than glorifying it and being grateful for it, right? So that's when things started to get, and still do, right? Those are still the instances where I am checked, where I am called angry, where I am called divisive, where I am called ungrateful or mean, right? It's those moments where either it's identity, white identity, that I'm decentering and I'm picking it up and I'm moving it around and I'm expressing its contours and how it functions, or I'm calling into question whiteness's role with Black bodies, right? I am going against the narrative of whiteness is a savior, is a balm to Blackness, is a good and necessary cultivator and civilizer of Blackness when it comes to transracial adoption. So where would these people be elsewhere?
Right.
So
where would they be
in either sense,
yeah.
That's when I'm pushed up against.
And I mean, the timing couldn't be better, because I'm seeing this play out with Amy Coney Barrett in her Supreme Court hearings this last week, which is kind of everything you've described up to this point.
Ranking Member Feinstein and members of the committee, I'm honored and humbled to appear before you today as a nominee for Associate Justice of the Supreme Court.
That was Amy Coney Barrett at the Supreme Court nomination hearing last week. I want to play the section in her opening statement where she speaks about each of her 7 children, 2 of whom were adopted from Haiti.
Jesse and I are parents to 7 wonderful children. Our oldest daughter, Emma, is a sophomore in college who just might follow her parents into a career in the law. Next is Vivian, who came to us from Haiti. When Vivian arrived, she was so weak that we were told she might never talk or walk normally. But now she deadlifts as much as the male athletes in our gym, and I assure you she has no trouble talking. Tess is 16, and while she shares her parents' love for the liberal arts, she also has a math gene that seems to have skipped her parents' generation. John Peter joined us shortly after the devastating earthquake in Haiti. And Jesse, who brought him home, still describes the shock on JP's face when he got off the plane in wintertime Chicago. Once that shock wore off, JP assumed the happy-go-lucky attitude that is still his signature trait. Liam is smart, strong, and kind, and to our delight, he still loves watching movies with Mom and Dad. 10-year-old Juliet is already pursuing her goal of becoming an author by writing multiple essays and short stories, one of which she recently submitted for publication. And our youngest, Benjamin, is at home with friends. Benjamin has Down syndrome, and he is the unanimous favorite of the family. He was watching the hearing this morning, I'm told, and he was calling out our names as he saw the kids in the back. My own siblings are here, some in the hearing room.
So remember how I told you about my Facebook post about this statement? Well, in my post, I had also stated that Amy's words were a prime example of implicit bias, unconscious racism, and white saviorism. This was not meant to be an attack on Amy Coney Barrett or challenging if she loves her children, but it did strike a nerve. It reached more than 1 million people in less than a week. It was shared over 10,000 times and had over 1,000 comments. This is not typical for my posts. People who leaned politically left used my post as reason to further judge Amy Coney Barrett's character. And people who were on the right were angry at anyone who questioned the integrity of someone like her, someone who would so nobly adopt 2 children. Then there was also a portion of people who heard Amy's words or read the transcript and had a more measured response to my post, writing, "Wow, I hadn't seen it that way. Thanks for sharing your perspective." That group of people gave me hope, even if they didn't fully agree with me, because my intention was to prompt people to hear her words through the lens of her 2 Black children, through my lens as a transracial adoptee. Now back to me and Torie. Many of us made some public comments, myself included, about the way that her opening statement spoke of her bio kids and her adopted kids, her 2 Haitian adopted children, who were all seated behind her in a row, so that what it seems like is white America, and it might be a little broader than that, maybe not just white America, but what the status quo still is was white savior narrative in a positive way. Look at what Amy Coney Barrett has done. She has a very interesting family. She must be anti-racist if she's adopted these Black children. Yet her language with that opening statement was clearly divided, that her bio kids she spoke of in ways that illuminated their intellect and illuminated the genetic tie to the intellect, and the Haitian kids she spoke of in terms of their traumas. And I found it really peculiar that many people couldn't see that bias that she unconsciously holds in this way. And it felt very divided, and it felt like this is a fight of challenging the status quo, which is what I heard you saying just now, that you would challenge status quo. That is when people would come up against you and be like, no. What were your thoughts around Amy Coney Barrett?
It's so painful to hear the words and the juxtaposition, right? It was the fact that like her children were described in vastly different terms. And, you know, one thing I thought was so interesting is you spoke, I spoke, several other transracial adoptees came to the forefront to kind of unpack this dominant adoption narrative where a white savior altruism is at the center. And so many people came in to defend Amy Coney Barrett in a way that has actually kind of scared me, if I'm going to be frank, because I'm thinking, none of these individuals have a direct tie, at least that I was seeing, to adoption. People that are why are you being so judgmental of her? You're being mean. She loves her children. Nobody ever said she doesn't love her children.
And
you can love your children and still participate in their oppression through the language you use. So I felt like people were really adamant to protect her, which makes sense because she's being put up as this, she's white, she's upper class, she is a person of faith, she's Catholic, she's a woman, and she's
highly intelligent,
right? I don't dislike Amy Coney Barrett. I don't want to attack her motherhood. I don't even know her.
But as transracial adoptees, I think it's really easy for us to be like in the bodies of her two Haitian kids. And what you said earlier about how people were always prescribing onto you what they wanted and wanted you to be is the experience that I was feeling inside for those two kids specifically. Like,
exactly.
Do I have a voice here, or am I just what my mom has now broadcast to the world that I am, which is this trauma survivor and nothing else? Right. And to sit there and kind of take it and now have the whole world, including us in some way,
talking about them,
including us, talking about them is problematic. It's an interesting dichotomy, because I do feel that when adoptive parents choose to make their kids' stories public, well, I'm trying to figure out what I feel when adoptive parents make their kids' stories public, because especially doing it without their kids' consent.
Right.
I'm wondering, does that then mean that they are free fodder for all? I don't want it to be such. I don't want them to become examples of whatever lesson we're trying to teach, microaggressions, but at the same time, they inevitably are, in the same way that we are, because we look different than our parents. And so it becomes inherent that other people comment and make judgments about our family.
Yeah.
You had said people came back at you like with Amy Coney Barrett loves her kids. And you had never said that she doesn't love her kids. Right. What is that about? And how are we going to be able to slip in something a little more nuanced there?
That is such a good question. The comeback of, but she loves her children, was so interesting to me, as if loving someone null and voids you from any opportunity to listen, to learn, to pivot, as if loving someone means there's no room for critique of that individual's behavior. Because to me, that's not love. To me, love is being able to say, I am a white individual who had the privilege of adopting, who had a choice in a decision that drastically impacted your life. And because of that, I will never know what it's like to be a person of color or to be an adoptee that constantly stands out as brown or black in a white family. Love says that because that's humble. And love says, if I say anything or do anything or act in a way that ever, puts you in a position of hurt or loss or grief, I want to know so that I can adjust. So it just was so strange that people felt like the love she had for her children exempted her. She is exempt from any wrongdoing. And actually, an individual wrote that explicitly on a comment that on my Facebook said, I am hesitant to critique anyone who adopts because it is a selfless act.
Wow. Yeah. The act of adopting seems to trump anything the adoptee says or feels or expresses.
spot on. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is so interesting because what does that say to an adoptee when they hear their parents lauded as being selfless? Like, what was it about me that adopting me was such a grand and noble act of generosity? And I want to know, are you using that language for your biological children? That you are so selfless to raise children that are biologically yours? Nobody, that's not the language that's being used. So you're othering adoptees inherently by saying their parents were selfless to adopt, because you're not saying that for the contrary. You're not saying to people, oh, look at you, you're a parent that's so selfless. It's every kind of parenting is some form of sacrifice. So to elevate one over the other, I think starts to make adoptees really question their worth and what kind of value they have, that to do something as simple as loving them is extraordinary.
What is it that makes it hard for society to hear this perspective? Not just hard, but, you know, I wrote for an anthology a few years back, and it's called Perpetual Children, Dismantling the Stereotype. And it was an anthology of essays written by adoptees written by adoptees who are trying to express how we are seen as children, even as adults, and that our parents' thoughts about adoption are always seen as more valid than ours. Right. I'm trying to figure out, is it that our experiences are not unified enough, that every adoptee story is unique and every way that we experience it is different, and therefore there's no unifying message and that's too hard? Or what is it that makes our message of not being okay with being used as a prop? What makes it so hard for that to be understood? Because I don't think it's just about race, which
it's not.
I would say, you know, obviously that people's emotions elevate sky high when race comes into the conversation. Or same with abortion and adoption. That conflation gets made a lot, and that is a hard conversation to have because it's just a hot button issue. But when it's not about any of those things, and it's just about us saying our experience, you know, for me, it was when I hear people calling my parents a saint for adopting, I would try to say, you know, how do you think that makes me feel hearing that? This was my approach to say, like, okay, think about it from my perspective. Like, what is it about me that I needed rescuing, saving, that only a saint could raise me?
Yeah.
But even that still doesn't get the traction that I intend.
Yeah. Honestly, I feel like a lot of this is tied to the role of children in our society. And it's not always been this way. I mean, children in, you know, the 18th, early 19th century were laborers. You know, you have kids because they go to work and they bring you money. But now kids are like these highly sentimental, valued beings that somehow are connected deeply to parents' identity. I think it is a conflation of identity that's happening. Of, you know, if you somehow, as an adoptee, have something critical to say about the system that rendered you adoptable, your displeasure is immediately linked to a failure on the part of your parents.
Wow. Yes.
Right? It's no longer about us. We are not we're not individuals. I don't believe children are treated as individuals. Children are treated as representations of their parents. They're treated as sometimes, status values associated with their parents. And
yeah, and when I think about Amy Coney Barrett, it's like what you said is right on, that from the little we know about her family, but just from her decision to have the kids as props and involved in this process, that they are not individuals, but they represent how she might vote in future cases.
Yep.
That
exactly.
This shows her anti-racism, which we know that's not how it works.
Right.
But this shows her pro-life stance.
Yeah.
Which
they're signals. They're signaling.
It's virtue signaling.
It's virtue signaling is exactly what it is. She didn't even honestly have to speak about them because they are transracial. They are hypervisible. So simply having them present is a virtue signal to especially a large conservative evangelical base of her faith, right? Yeah. Well, obviously those children aren't hers, which means she adopted them. And a lot of people are going to make the cognitive assumption, because they are Black, that they are not from the US, that they came from a poor country, right? And if that's the case, then she is abiding by the biblical statute of caring for the poor and the widowed. So, I mean, literally people make that jump simply by seeing the bodies of her Black children. That's the problem.
Yet there have been, you and I are speaking daily, pouring out our soul. It's emotional work.
And are you a hugger? Do you like hugs?
Do I like hugs?
Yeah, because I would just love to hug you.
Oh, you're so sweet.
When we're pouring our souls out, it's like sometimes I just wish I could go hug another transracial adoptee that's doing all this work.
Oh, it's so funny. I think when you said, "Are you a hugger?" my brain had like a conniption, because I'm like, I don't think I've hugged anyone for 7 months, and so I forgot. Like, wait, what does that mean? Was it like
what is a hug?
Yes.
You cannot compute.
Yes, COVID is really redrawing some boundaries. But there are transracial adoptees who've been writing, who've been publishing research on this for decades. And so that's kind of where I'm getting stuck. Yeah. How does this narrative change? How can we help broaden this to respect us, to see us not as symbols of something for our parents to feel proud of?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it starts with like basic education of American history and child welfare, and recognizing that Christianity was used as a colonizing tool for Native people and for, assimilating Black, brown, indigenous individuals into the fabric of America. Like, people don't want to hear that.
But I also think, Ibram X. Kendi, he wrote the guidebook on this. He has written about how to be an
anti-racism,
with a historical context, and people loved his book, right? Bestseller for weeks on end. Yet, when he tweeted about how Amy Coney Barrett may be a colonizer because of her being transracial adoptive parent, he tweeted this.
I didn't know this.
Powerful tweet.
Wow.
The very people who have loved his book and appreciated all his work then came and responded to his tweet with, "You have no idea what you're talking about. You are no longer the expert that I thought you were."
Oh my gosh.
He is a wonderful person and a great parent. So I hear you when you're like, yeah, we got to go back to history to think about how the child welfare system was built upon breaking up families. And there are words we use like put up for adoption, which is directly
yeah.
stems from putting up slaves on a box to get auctioned off. Like that's where that language came
Right.
from. We could educate on all of that, yet the feeling of adoption as this noble act is continues to prevail.
I mean, I guess I wonder, because there's so many audiences, right? So I guess I wonder, the audience for Ibram Kendi are the same people that are saying, like, you don't know what you're talking about anymore. Are those everyday people, or are these social workers and adoption professionals? Like, I guess I kind of feel like, in my view, and I'd love to know your point of view here, in my view, that kind of research and education isn't making it into the adoption sphere. I feel like the adoption sphere is kind of a bubble, because I know lots of people, like you said, his book has been bestseller. A lot of people that were formerly inept at discussing and understanding racism are now gaining a language for it. But I feel like it's just not getting through the walls of adoption.
Yeah, it's so true. It's funny because it's definitely, it's broken through the prison system, so people understand and can link the industrialized prison complex with racism. They get that. It's broken through around immigration. People understand our racism around anti-immigrants and how terribly we treat immigrants. It has, I'm trying to think of other sectors where people have understood racism is at play here. But I think you're right that adoption, for some reason, it is not a space where people are open to that. And there's something about that altruism.
I think you said something important there. You said the word altruism, which, where's the other sector that altruism comes into play hugely? The church.
The church.
And I think the church and the adoption sphere, which are unfortunately very entangled, are the two places that are not absorbing this knowledge.
Wow. So an altruistic attitude exempts you from any sort of racism. It's as though racism is something that people consciously do, when in reality, we know it's subconscious. We know it's baked into so many of the systems. And we aren't saying that Amy Coney Barrett is a racist. We're saying that she's participating in this system that,
which interestingly, in her hearing, she did not have anything to say about systemic racism. If you remember that, she said, I will say unequivocally that racism exists in the US. That's not controversial, but I don't know what to say about its diagnosis or how it functions, if it's systemic or if it's just overt hatred. She had nothing to say about that.
Wow. I didn't listen to that part, I don't think, but I did go back and read one of her former opinions on a workplace hostility issue, and she deemed in her dissent that just the use of the N-word in a workplace was not enough to call it a toxic work environment. And that was really fascinating to me as well.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you're saying these areas aren't recognizing it as baked in, as it's part of it's literally in the soil. Because there's environmental racism too.
One of the things that seems so obvious to me, in the same way that we can say, like, wow, look at the prison population, and you're really, it's clear the disproportionality, how many Black and brown people are in prison versus white people versus the society overall. Like, clearly Black people are overrepresented in prisons. It's similar for me when I think about transracial adoption and who is adopting, and it is white people by and large. There are small groups of Black and brown adoptive parents, but proportionally, white people are the adopters and Black and brown people are being adopted. And I'm like, that reeks of some sort of race issue, just in the same way that we have disproportionality in some of these other systems. And why is that not kind of proof enough for people to be like, oh, wait, why is transracial adoption synonymous with white people adopting brown kids?
Exactly. I mean, what are the images that we tout of transracial adoption? And actually, interestingly, like the majority of children that are adopted are white.
Right.
But the ones we see, the adoptions, that's the thing about transracial adoption is you see it, right? It's visible. And that then becomes the image that is blown up onto a national stage as being representative of transracial adoption, representative of like Christian values, and representative of how could there possibly be anything racially problematic when they're a family. I think that's the other thing, is people don't believe that if you're bringing someone into your family, that can be done under the auspices of a bad, unethical mentality. Oh. They don't believe that. And I think that's the interesting thing to me as somebody that's like studying this, is people don't believe that money, that politics, that class, that race come into the realm of family and love and intimacy. But if you really think about it, every family is impacted by those factors. No family is exempt from economic influences, from political influences, from race and class and gender. None are.
Right.
But again, it goes unnoticed, right? Because it's under the veil of whiteness. When you have transracial adoption, everybody sees what's happening, but they still are associating it with, oh, it's just love and family and intimacy. But love is commercialized. Oh, intimacy is commercialized. Family is commercialized. You cannot escape that. And I think that's a fundamental thing that people just don't buy into. I mean, there are apps for finding love. There are matchmaking services for finding love.
Right.
You know? There's the wedding industry, which gives billions of dollars off of you vowing your life to someone else. So why is it so incredibly asinine to think that family and adoption could also be impacted by capitalism, by commercialization?
So the other piece I think that bears us giving some credence to is birth parents. You know, part of me, I'm so aware that we've had this wonderful conversation that's so titillating. I love it. Yet you and I have failed to even bring in birth parent perspectives on all of this. Like, what about Amy Coney Barrett's 2 children's birth parents? How did they hear what Amy said about her kids going from zero to hero, from rags to riches? Where do they fit within this concept of family? I think one of the things that I'm working hard on is this concept of openness, and in working really hard to have adoptive families embrace a more open attitude, which means including their kids' birth parents in their daily lives. And that is a really difficult thing for people. And I think it falls along some of the lines that you're talking about. And it also comes back to this nuclear family model that we love, which does not leave room for other people.
When does not.
Some of the healthiest people around the world grew up in collectivist sort of culture.
Non-nuclear families. Yeah.
Right.
That's so true. And that's just I think that's a really great point of, this is such a buzz topic now. And I'm very glad adoptees are weighing in, but there is another point of the constellation that is impacted by that narrative and that language. Because what does that say about that first family, that first culture, that first heritage, that they went from zero to hero, right? What are the value placements there that are damaging?
Yes. Why is it so easy for us to discard those voices?
Yeah. And why are they such a threat to adoptive families, right? And I think it goes back to that desire with children to, it's possessive in a way.
Ownership.
The child is ours. Ownership of a child that gives us a sentimental feeling, gives us affection and status and fulfillment, right? Yeah, it's messy. And I think honestly, that's the thing that everybody that I've been seeing speak out on this issue wants. It's not to condemn Amy Coney Barrett. It is certainly not to put her children in an uncomfortable position or to attack her children. It's not about her judicial and political affiliations. This is about getting people to see adoption as complex. That's it, as complex and nuanced. It's not a flat, one-size-fits-all, standard, repeated narrative for all. That's the goal, at least for me, and what I've seen from a lot of other people is we're not trying to create a culture war here. We're just trying to allow space for Black and brown adoptees to expand into their truth.
I want to thank Torie for this conversation. People all along the political spectrum, on the left or the right, adopt transracially and cross-culturally. So it stymies me as to why and how adoption has managed to become so politicized. But then again, so has everything else. The conversations about transracial adoption are so divided that hearing directly from transracial adoptees isn't enough to counter the dominant fairy tale narrative. Even upon presenting overwhelming evidence of institutionalized racism within the child welfare system, the idea that transracial adoption could be a form of colonization and imbue white supremacy is immediately shut down, and we revert back to the status quo. But one thing I know for sure is that transracial adoptees will keep speaking out, and someday our complex stance will be incorporated into the mainstream dialogue anytime adoption is discussed. If you liked this episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review, rate it, and share it with your friends and family. Once again, I'm Angela Tucker. You can follow me on Instagram at AngieAdoptee, Twitter or Facebook at The Adopted Life, or check out my website at angelatucker.com. This episode was edited by my husband, Brian Tucker. The music is courtesy of Marmoset and Artlist. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next week on The Adoptee Next Door.